because the motion says
Global tax.
I was really demonstrate the motion say that it shall distribute all global tax income to countries on a per capita basis. So per capita basis, according to this one, is purpose that shared equally among all.
Yeah, no, per capita, right? That's not the dictionary, right? Per capita is like Latin for pro rata lah. So it means that if you make more as an individual,
But for example, okay, if Nigeria makes 1, US makes 9, then per capita does it mean at 5 or it will be 9 to Nigeria?
say what's the
Say per person or per person more.
on a per capita basis in the motion rate?
It shall distribute all global tax income to countries per capita basis.
Shit. Oh shit. Let's control this. So per capita doesn't seem very intuitive to me. So you collect all the money, you give everybody equal amount of money. It's weird. Can we like say
Because then if it's per capita basis, then you have to then with like populated countries you get more now. Correct, right? Like China will get more because they have more people there.
wow, that's different ideology.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay, so I don't, as a motion, like if I'm coming up with a motion, I don't think I'll make a motion that says populous countries get more tax, get more money.
Yeah, I think even if that's the thing, right? Is it based on population or is it just equally general amount?
Okay, what's the logic behind that? So, Gab, what would you say? Equal means like equality, but you know, equality and equity aren't the same things, right? So you can't just give everybody equal rights. Like the wall analogy, a short person must have 2 boxes. So the motion seems to me to be more hardline, more debatable if you say Nigeria needs money now.
Okay, then you're running out.
I don't know. I feel like that's the debate. What do you guys think?
I'm really big.
What do you do with it?
You want to just about
But assuming it's the first one, the one where Nigeria gets more, that's easier one.
Yeah,
This one's socialist.
I think the one the second one. But I think the benefit is the same. Because compared to status quo is better, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because you can see it's run the same argument.
Same argument. The point here is that we need to get more money into
Yeah,
it.
more money is.
oh fuck, it's population.
Really?
Yeah.
So the more amount of people they have, the more money they need. Yeah. Ah, okay. Now I know the argument. So the problem with the global financial industry, global financial system is that the wealth is held by 1% of the population.
Oh yeah, correct.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
So that means the vast majority of people in the world, the vast majority of people living in rural China, living in rural India,
Yeah.
don't get to access any part of the wealth
Right,
that is hoarded by Scandinavian, Nordic countries, stuff like that, who have more money than they're living in. So money should be about people, and we're about people, so we want to help. Okay, now I can do this now. No problem. Okay, so first, let's go. Hey, really good. First, we're going to need a global body to which all your tax revenue will be surrendered.
Okay,
At that point, that global body will be, calculate off a metric of population densities where the money goes. That means that a bigger population density would mean more money is allocated there.
Right.
The reason we need to do this is because this year opening line like 1% of the world holds all the wealth, and that's abhorrent. So let's talk about the harms of this.
Oh, you asked Aditya already, yeah?
Yeah.
Is it?
You said more populous.
Yeah, more populous, right? Correct.
Okay, yeah, good catch, Dave.
Yeah, if not,
That's close. Not GG.
Okay.
Okay, so that's where like God, Pedro. Okay, the first one. Let's talk about why some countries with
Wait, what do we want to What do we want to characterize first?
characterize like what is a rich country, what is a characterize how the
how the
How the world
Yeah,
day works, right?
Yes. how wealth is being dispersed.
So is this debate like universal basic income lah?
That's it.
Debate lah.
That's great. No, but it's a little bit different than that
It's a bit different lah.
because of population consideration.
Okay, so how is wealth being dispersed? The richest countries in the world are also at the one.
No, because US is one of the most populous countries in the world. US and China are very big.
Yeah, yes, China. Yeah. So do you get more? Doesn't matter.
No, but they also make more. Okay?
Yeah.
So like,
so same.
I'm thinking Scandinavia, like these Nordic countries, they're sparsely underpopulated, but they
Yeah,
make the most out
Canada,
of it.
Canada is underpopulated.
Underpopulated, but they make a lot of money. The reason why Scandinavia,
So if they push back China and US, they push back Pakistan.
Yeah.
Right, because they also lost.
So do I say that this debate wouldn't really be about China and US? Because
no, it should be about that. It should be about everybody. It should be about where the vast majority of people are. That's where the money needs to be. So
Yeah.
our policy is about better distribution of wealth. That's the end goal. And our burden is to prove how we achieve better distribution of wealth in the world. And the harm here is that the mismanagement of wealth, the locking up of wealth in the 1%, has led to vast swaths of people in the vast majority of the world to suffer horrible harms. Like healthcare is terrible, schooling is terrible, they can barely eat. Cost of imports, you want to talk about Dutch disease?
Yeah,
Like,
and,
Cost of imports are so high.
yeah, like falling oil prices in Venezuela. I became Venezuela. Venezuela is suffering now.
okay, so how is wealth currently being dispersed? Do I say one about the 1%? So usually,
Maybe you want to characterize the responsibility of the international community. Like, why should we give a fuck?
I think you don't need this one.
Don't you, right? It's a given that we want to help people.
okay, so what I characterize how wealth is currently being dispersed, right?
How is wealth currently being dispersed? So the reality of the world, it's currently 80 minutes.
Okay.
The reality of the world is that many rich countries are often underpopulated. A prime example here would be the Nordic countries like Finland or Scandinavia. The reason why these countries are really, really rich,
Yeah,
is that they just so happen
because we have
to,
massive resources,
Yeah.
but small amount of people.
so they just happen to be formed over like oil lions and whatever. So you get a massive centralization of wealth in the top 1% of the world's population, like the global population.
Usually they counter prop. We would global tax income, we would not give it per capita. We give it if you need it. Then no debate.
Then we say, but you do need it if you have more people.
Parallel debate.
It's harder.
Yeah, that is harder than the first one that we thought, right?
So these countries happen to come across the riches either by luck.
Luck of the draw, like in the Scandinavian countries, or by horrible things, like in the UK, by colonization, by the luck of either geography or by the luck of history. For example, like the United Kingdom, who are one of the smallest population-wise countries in the world, yet are still incredibly rich because of the colonies that they used to own. In fact, a lot of these colonies that they owned once before, especially in Central and Western Africa, are now the most destitute countries with the biggest populations. Okay, cool.
I think there's also an argument about how it impacts immigration policies.
Yes, like the free labor movement and stuff like that, right? So I guess the idea here is nationalism, right? So why should Scandinavia have an exclusive stake to the oil that's in Scandinavia?
Yeah.
That's the thing that we need to dissolve. So we're trying to say that Scandinavia doesn't have an exclusive. The oil belongs to the world. How do we make that point?
Also, how like more money means more like bargaining chip in the trade thing.
Yeah. So political clout.
So, like,
Okay, if you're going to give more money to like China and US, wouldn't they already have clout?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Okay, first of all, I think let's just list the harms. Then the first harm is that a world in which the vast majority of us is suffering is not a world that I want to live in. So I'm happy to override the sovereignty of a nation if it means alleviating the suffering of people around the world. So that's why I'm happy to take Scandinavia's wealth and distribute it more evenly, rather than have it stay locked up. Okay, that's the first one.
so that's the first comparative is.
And so you characterize like how the vast majority of people in the world are suffering, they don't have healthcare or whatever, and this will persist. So, okay, I think the first thing you need to say is how the 1% came to be wealthy is often arbitrary, and it's often based on the luck of geography or the luck of history. So we don't think that Scandinavia has any exclusive claim to the oil. And even if they did, we're happy to override that, seeing that vast majorities of people around the world are suffering. And that is the priority, alleviation of that suffering. That's the first harm. And that's the first harm that the suffering will continue forever. The second harm is that political clout is often tied to how much money you have. So
Yeah.
if we want a democratic global community where all nations are able to voice their opinions freely, the problem is like I think it's going to be too far now. But anyway, it kind of it's counterintuitive to have small nations wield the greatest amount of economic clout
Yeah.
when they're the least representative.
Yeah. So you say, for example, in trade agreements, like poorer countries will often lose out because they have to agree anyway to the criteria of the certain clause.
And the example here is India, who for centuries have missed out on trade unions and have suffered from bad trade deals because
They simply could reject, right? Because reject is suffer more, so like the more power.
yeah, so you have a global sphere which is dominated by the 1%, and that's undemocratic. And we would prefer a global community where better representation would be achieved.
Okay. So I already characterized rich countries and the biggest countries. Well, I need some examples of these countries that we're going to defend. Okay, so who? Pakistan?
Pakistan,
Pakistan, India, Nigeria.
Indonesia, Malaysia.
Indonesia is huge, right?
Yeah.
Indonesia,
like South Africa.
they're quite huge. I would say Nigeria. They're big. Uganda, big.
Then we also say China, right?
Yeah, sure.
Or do we mention?
I don't mind.
No, we didn't mention.
Like, even if it comes up, right? It's aligned with our principle.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go straight into arguments. Okay, so what's the first?
What I don't understand is, how did China become so rich? Because if we're going to say it's arbitrary history, I can explain colonization, whatever, but China is a bit of an oddity. They had no slavery. It didn't colonize.
Slavery, the corporate.
No labor laws and that shit, right? Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, are we going to prove why these countries are liable?
Yeah. So, for example, that they are hoarders of wealth.
What do you think immigration? So we more people we have, so we could have both. So we don't have incentive to take more people in, right?
Yeah.
Are they going to get more money?
But I don't think immigration will suddenly, like, say I'm Britain, right? I take in, 7 minutes left. I can't just take in like 70,000 Polish people and expect to get that much more of them. I'm thinking like Dutch disease. So if I've got Scandinavia, which is very rich, and all the other countries very poor, Scandinavia's currency would appreciate, and that means that imports would be very expensive, and it'll happen like it happened in Venezuela. So isn't it in Scandinavia's interest that the rest of the world is richer too?
I think we need to prove that, right? Because we just fuck them with
Fuck
it.
them.
Whether they have interest or not, we take part in it.
Okay, so why are all countries liable? One is submission. Two is like they've actively put.
I think you like start with the worst and then develop down. So you start by saying a lot of these countries that are now destined, really rich, are rich because at the expense of the countries that are now really destitute. Yeah. And I think the example here is the UK enjoys a lot of wealth that was rightfully stolen, actually, that was unlawfully stolen from a lot of their colonies in Africa and a lot of their colonies in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I think
These same countries, now that they've been rich with their resources and wealth, are the most destitute and the most populous and destitute at the same time. So how can UK lay claim to that profit that they made? The US also rose to economic power off the backs of slave labor that they imported from countries that are now really destitute.
So I think there's also argument about how investment are more likely to come into developing countries. They have more money. It's like, for example, people when they have more money, corporations coming and this kind of argument.
Okay, I think three things. One, if I have more money, they're more likely to get loans from the international community. Right now, it's like the IMF and the World Bank, they want to give loans, development aid to shit countries so they don't have a record to back it up. So this means that you're likely to see more development. I think this is the tangible benefits after International One. You'll get more development in these nations. Second, more FDI. So when there's more development, then private companies will be more incentivized to place their money there to be safer, stronger.
They hire people.
Yeah, strong economy, they hire people, and as a result,
Okay, let's go straight into tangible benefits.
Okay, so after you explain the harms about how the world is all poor and shit, like this alleviates that because one, when money is distributed evenly, it means more money will be put in the hands of very destitute nations, and that has a variety of good effects. The first is that they're more likely to be loaned to. Right now, the World Bank and the IMF are very reserved about giving money and development aid to poor countries like Uganda because they have a horrible track record on repaying those loans.
Okay, so firstly, we proved that money to give into the hands of the destitute, that's just good for have all the people and shit like that.
Also, they can get more loans. So like for them to start certain industry or them to initiate certain things, they need money. Like the more.
And I'm trying to like come up with an idea of why is this good for the international community, like the international market. I'm trying to think that perhaps if you help countries like Uganda and whatever develop, they become better manufacturing industries.
I feel that what is like if it's true, they would have done it anyway, right?
Yeah.
So I think they must be like we will harm certain countries in order to help the countries. Right? Both benefit, then they would done it anyway instead of school.
Okay, so the tangible benefits are one, money given to the most destitute. So this means they can invest back into people. What does this mean? So we can give more loans.
No, so international community, so they can get more development aid, they can get more loans to start things. Yeah, they wouldn't have start. They couldn't start in the first place.
Yeah, because the World Bank won't give you money if you're a bankrupt guy.
Yeah.
Right? So similarly, the World Bank only gives countries money if it can show that it can pay the loans. So by having a per capita system, you're more likely to get loans. Those loans will be used for development, which empowers people to start their own businesses, to have a better quality of life. Second one, you get more FDI. A lot of like capital stays out of these countries, capital flight, because the currency isn't stable.
Wait, so they get more loans from the international community, and with those loans, what do they do?
They develop. It's called development aid. So they'll build, better schools, better industries, whatever, and the people can enjoy.
Why does it happen to the point at which they're richer?
Huh?
Why does it happen only when they're richer?
Oh, because I won't give banks like the World Bank won't give development aid to poor nations because they cannot
They
pay
cannot
back.
pay back. Why? They cannot pay back, or they see at the failing countries that cannot come back. So no point doing that.
Yeah, and the second one is FDI. So capital often stays out of really poor places because the currency fluctuates. Like in Venezuela, where it used to be 6.23 to 1, and now it's like 172, a lot of capital flight. So by giving more money to these nations, you can like solidify their currency, allow them to be more stable, you like to get more capital. This is good because a lot of these nations also suffer from like really conservative governments that are harmful to the people and very insular, so like a lot of protectionist policies, a lot of stuff like that, right?
Okay,
So when capital comes in, what does that affect where like they open up, like it happened in China in the 70s, where capital came into China opened up to the world.
So the reason why they have protectionist policy because they don't want to lose money. Oh, macam Venezuela lah ni.
Yeah, because capital is like what? But I'm trying to make an argument that says FDI is good. You need more FDI. Not just monetarily, but socially. So it's good that
Hire people, they need.
that, but also like I'm trying to think of the ideology, because what?
Oh, I think we should think a bit more that. You see like it's like it's like government corrupted, government corrupted, big government, so we also have to support the government.
Right. You did.
But if you see the government is shit, then we say they have more shit, right? But now they have more money. So let's decide to be shit. Even if they take more money, but we win on others.
Okay, so I got the FDI and shit like that. Okay, what about the whole thing about lobbying in the international market?
Okay, so you have
community.
Yeah. What lobby?
So you see this now that now these countries are now more at a equal position.
Yeah. So whenever they trade things, whenever they trade agreements or like sign certain bilateral agreements, they often lose out because they have no money because they have to deal with shit terms.
Yeah. Thanks for over.
Because they are desperate now. When they are not in a position of desperation, they can.
Oh, I think it's the harm, like the exploitation of weaker nations. That's the argument, not just the exploitation of weaker nations. So as long as the 1% of the world control the wealth, they're able to disproportionately harm lower nations and they lose out in trade deals, stuff like that. So you balance the ability of nations to weigh on the discourse.
Damn cool.
Is there anything else?
You got right.
Yeah. take this. Alright, take it out this time. Like that, I'll want it. Right. Let me rush to the toilet. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I never watched this too. I just like, you know, sound
You do. I'll give you one extra speaker point.
oh, thank you. Yeah. See, this guys are. So, tomorrow I do this one. Must California. Must dress well. And at first it feels like a bit sort of rejection. Now everyone dress well. And I'm like,
She started it.
China?
yes.
Oh, thanks, buddy. There you go.
Okay, welcome to round 3 of video 2016. My name is Ruben, the chair for this round. Single chair, I have 3 trainees. Their names are here. What? Wang Qing and on the motion, what's the motion?
The global tax.
Something about global tax.
No.
What?
See food that it sounds to distribute all global tax income to countries with a per capita income.
On that motion, I invite the Prime Minister to give today's.
As long as the 1% maintain their privilege, inequality will only further subjugate the most destitute and the most vulnerable. We will destroy the system that has for years denied an inclusivity of the poor and re-establish a world that caters to all, regardless of the backgrounds that put you in those positions. We fight for equality, we fight for equal opportunity. The first thing we're going to do from Team Government is establish the mechanism in approaching this debate. The mechanism is twofold. We think that nations currently make money in a lot of different ways. They have FDI, they have their property tax, and they have an inheritance tax. And usually richer countries make a lot more revenue when it comes to their tax income. So in our world, the first prong is we're going to force all countries to pool their tax income into a global financial institution such as the IMF. The second prong, therefore, is the revenue that they pool in will be returned proportionally to how many people there are in certain countries. So this means that in countries which have a bigger population density, they get much more money back from this pool of money given to the IMF. And here's why. The first thing we're going to characterize to you in question is, how is wealth currently being dispersed? No, thank you. We think that many of the richest countries in the world are also some of the most underpopulated. We see, for example, in Canada, for example, in Scandinavian countries. And we think the reason why they're so rich is they happen to come across their money through two ways. One, via luck. Simply because they happen to exist along coastlines, because their soil happened to be that much more fertile, they were able to monopolize and capitalize on that privilege. But two, within they also came to that money through imposing standards onto other countries. So we have the UK, which imposed colonialism that left African states destitute, and this created a structural privilege that allowed them to continue getting more benefits off the sufferings of other nations. We think the biggest countries in the world also have the most disempowerished citizens. And here's why. Because as the amount of citizens in your country increase, you have a lack of resources to establish equal quality in a lot of different sectors. This means they cannot create infrastructure that's equal to healthcare or healthcare that's equal to education. So the cutting of costs then means they aren't able to create benefits or resources that's affordable and safe for their people. For example, in India, 1 out of 4 people are trapped in absolute poverty, and the way in which we deal with them is awful because we cannot give them means of welfare to get them out of those situations. And the examples that we're talking about here are Pakistan, Indonesia, Nigeria, and I said before, India. No, thank you. Therefore, the second question we're going to ask, on why are all countries liable in the progress of the people and how this best helps the world? So the first thing we need to prove is why the international community is liable and should have their money taken from them. We think, as we said before, a lot of countries that are rich come at the expense of other countries. So this means that when we do impose colonialism, not only do you make that structural benefit to your favor, but that means you denied India the ability to opt into global institutions for years because they were victims of the UK colonialism that left their internal structures destroyed. We also think the USA rode off the backs of slavery, and this created structural barriers. But the principle here also is that if you are a richer country and you fail to act and you do not use your privilege to help others, this is an act of omission. Because we think that you are complicit in hurting more people, the point at which you do not use your privilege to make sure that victims aren't given as best treatment as they can. For example, we have Good Samaritan laws that mandate, regardless of whether you were directly in that fight or not, if you see a crime going on and you do not act, you are criminally liable. The pushback that we push to these groups is that for the countries that got their power through subjugating the poor, that for the countries who got their power through not acting and allowing the poor countries to destroy themselves, they need to defend individuals that are liable for all the harms that happen to these poorer countries. But before I move on to the second level, yes.
Does your policy mean that a burgeoning economy like China will receive more resources or revenue rather than countries that are underprivileged like South Sudan?
Yes, they will. Because we think they have a big population, they have a lot of individuals to cater for, and we can increase the quality of infrastructure or opportunities in that country for all. That's still a benefit to our side, which you don't get. But the second level, on how this helps victims of inequality. We think that firstly, money is given to the most destitute of countries. And this means that countries in Indonesia or China itself, with a huge population, they can invest a lot more money back into the people. So this means that they can improve the quality of welfare and basic resources. Here's a comparative to your side. If you push on towards China, I push on to you, for example, the Netherlands, where they don't need as much money, but they keep it centralized on a population that isn't as disempowerished. When we do get more money, we can put a lot more into innovation and into making sure these individuals have better qualities of life. But the second benefit that we give to you is that one, they can get more loans from the international community, because we don't give loans to poor nations when we don't believe they can pay back. But the point at which they become richer and have more of an ability to spend and also reimburse their economies, we'll give them more loans. And this means that they can invest more into development and innovation. They can focus on building up their markets to give them some form of independence in the global market and have some form of agency over the way they trade. We think this also allows them to have more of a diversification of goods when they get more loans from international communities. The pushback is you need to defend countries which are already poor and have like people in awful conditions, not being able to improve the conditions by having less money. No, thank you. The third benefit that we can give to you is we think in our world, you're going to have a lot more FDI from other countries, because we don't go into countries where their currency fluctuates. We don't go into countries where the economy can directly cause my institution to also suffer as well. For example, in Venezuela, because of the Dutch disease, because of capital flight, we see a lot of foreign companies leaving. And this means that people in that country aren't able to have an access to opportunities. When we do have more FDI coming in now, because the countries have a much stronger economy, or at least one that's stable in the long term, because they'll always be getting back the income from other countries, you have much more competition between institutions in that country. You have accessibility of privileges to these individuals, but you also have jobs for them. But the most important benefit that we can give to you is why now these countries have more agency over their own decisions. Currently, there's always an exploitation of poorer countries because they have no access to an alternative. They cannot opt out of trade with the richer country, because that means that they'll have to give no trade to their people. That's why in poorer countries, they sell their foods cheaper. In poorer countries, they're looser on regulations for international corporations. When we have more money and we aren't as dependent on them, we're able to make much more demands on these corporations. That means we can make sure that they don't hurt our people, and even if they do, we can finally push them off and we won't suffer the complete loss of that. In your world, you need to push back, you need to defend worse conditions for these individuals. We also think on an international market, you're able to demand more from other countries when you have more to give back in return as well. So if I'm richer, I can go into your countries as well, and we can form better diplomatic relations there instead of them always having to come to us. We can start moving out and expanding as countries and as regions, and this means that in the future we'll be able to not only depend on our own economies, but the economies of other countries as well. And this can only happen the point at which they have income that's able to not only cover their basic needs, but also allows them to go further into other countries. And they need to be rich through this. You take that away from them, and you take away the opportunity that they need to stop being poor and start being able to give to their people and give back to the world.
Thank the speaker for his speech. We will not case the opposition bench and invite the movement forward.
It wasn't enough for SID to run a debate on egalitarian principles and hope that a lot of countries will want to participate in the model that it provided. Because the truth is, Mr. Speaker, a lot of countries out there run on a realistic expectation of what taxation really is. The fact that if you are to work hard, Mr. Speaker, and pay for tax, that means that you have a reasonable interest for that money to then come back to you. Under no circumstance, Mr. Speaker, did SID provide under his speech, or is it okay for you to work hard and have that money go to another country at the end of the day? One huge rebuttal before I move on with my issue, Mr. Speaker. Do countries have a global duty? And here's where SID's model doesn't really partake. Firstly, SID never really said why there's a global interest when tax operates, Mr. Speaker, on a basis of getting that money back in some way. Because at no point would it then benefit everyone, Mr. Speaker, if America were to pay more for South Sudan to then prosper under their side of the house. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, why in the world would America want to pay global tax, Mr. Speaker, for China, which they don't like at all? We think it's very likely that America will say, screw off in a certain circumstance, Mr. Speaker. You have to tell us why there's also a likelihood for America to say that this will then happen. But thirdly, Mr. Speaker, SID never really wanted to say why is it okay for countries to lose their money at a certain point in which they have worked very hard in order to get back. Because if I'm an American citizen, Mr. Speaker, and I pay tax, I also reasonably think that that money will go to another person who is poor within my own country, who is within close proximity to me. Somehow I can benefit better than that money going to someone in China. But lastly, Mr. Speaker, realize the premise in which SIT wants to operate the debate on. That countries with a huge metric of population deserve this by virtue of having a lot of people who have a lot of babies. I don't think China, with a booming economy already, wants to get more money, Mr. Speaker, because you do acknowledge that countries like South Sudan, who have very low populations, will get even less money, although when arguably, for a fact, South Sudan needs this money more than China does. The stance that we are having under opposition, Mr. Speaker, no thank you, sir, is to tell you why global income tax, a global tax, is disproportionately unfair to people and states who already practice the understandable tax policies in status quo. Our burden goes twofold, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, why global tax is not effective and is principally wrong, Mr. Speaker, and secondly, why this metric is not effective. So let's talk about the first issue, why global tax is principally wrong under three key aspects. Firstly, let's clarify why tax is exactly important for two prongs. Firstly, tax has a relationship of you and the state. That you promise a fee in return of the infrastructure that you've benefited from when it comes to the state helping you, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what healthcare is or welfare. But that relationship should only extend to the duty of care that you have over your own people. You have to tell us why China's healthcare will somehow benefit someone in America should you extend that line of logic. The second prong, Mr. Speaker, that this relationship that is created between the state and the individual itself is in close proximity, and here's where it's reasonably important. Because if I'm an American citizen, then I also need to have reasonable expectations that if it doesn't go back, that money goes back to a person who is also American, Mr. Speaker, or however it can benefit from in that certain scenario. If it benefits a poor American citizen, that also benefits a rich American citizen at the end of the day. Second aspect, take all of this, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the dynamics of taxation and their proposal of how that money goes elsewhere or within further proximities away from your own country. This is especially pernicious, no thank you, when the world is at a turning point of understanding how taxation really works. People are becoming increasingly more aware of returns that come from tax, Mr. Speaker, and why it should come back to them when it comes to welfare. That's the reason why people were very mad at people like Emma Watson getting away at the Panama Papers, Mr. Speaker, or even President Putin, or even then. That's the reason why Swiss bank accounts now have to cooperate with the government in telling you that these people need to be taxed and they can no longer run away with all their offshore accounts. Because these people that you talk about never contribute back to a society, Mr. Speaker, and that's counterproductive to individuals who have worked hard to ensure that the state has a continuous progression of moving forward. Third key aspect, Mr. Speaker, no thank you, why it undermines countries that are established with good policies. The idea of a global tax means that you never really understand the importance of different countries and why they make up for the lack of difference in their policies, Mr. Speaker. It isn't luck that SIT wanted us to believe in, Mr. Speaker, because even Canada had to work hard to utilize all the resources that they probably have. But I'll tell you why this premise can also be untrue. Because South Sudan has a lot of oil, but they also need all that money. They don't get a lot of money back, Mr. Speaker, because they have to go through things such as solving corruption. That is inherently a problem that South Sudan created for themselves at the end of the day. But a better example is how Singapore doesn't have any resources at all, but still have a huge economy that is booming in a certain scenario. Let's dig the nail in the coffin and say that China, which has a lot of people, isn't a country that you wanted to say that because they have a lot of people, they are not really thriving. Just because by virtue of saying China, you can understand why exactly. But before that, sure.
These people work hard to get their own money. So why should they pay tax to their own state if they really own the money in the first place?
Oh, no. Well, we're talking about proximity, not really about why global tax isn't a thing, Mr. Speaker. Second thing, why the metric is not effective under that side of the house. Let's deconstruct what per capita really means under that side, right? Firstly, what's the premise? That people, or how many people you have in a country equates to how deserving you are of that tax. Because if it's true, then China will get more than South Sudan. You have to tell us why China, with a larger population, deserves that money more than South Sudan, acknowledging the disparity between how well the economies are necessarily doing. But secondly, let's isolate this principle, right? China arguably doesn't really need this at all, Mr. Speaker, but they'll get the most amount of money because China has the most amount of people other than India, right? Which means that countries which are getting this money are arguably don't really deserve it anyway, Mr. Speaker. But thirdly, will this entirely be effective? Because acknowledge how it will happen under that side of the house. Different countries have different ways of utilizing the amount of money that they will then have. I can argue to you, Mr. Speaker, that it is better that a poor person in America gets that taxation because Obamacare is something that cares for the effectiveness of that money. You give money to certain countries which may be corrupt, Mr. Speaker, and do not utilize that money entirely well. Why should the American people be the burden of take upon the burden of other countries such as that? I hope you answer. Proud to oppose.
Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for your speech. To extend the case for government,
What's really awkward is that China is a burgeoning economy that makes lots and lots of money. The question then becomes, why are there still swaths of people in the Xinjiang province or the Shenzhen province who still don't have enough to eat or still don't have a hospital in close proximity? Surely that indicates that per capita or the population is an important nuance to consider in the distribution of wealth, and we would argue is the best metric to which we can best distribute wealth in a world where most of the wealth is locked up in the countries in the 1%. We think that's abhorrent. In my speech, I'm going to tell you why this is the best metric and why it changes the nuances of soft politics in the world and why you get better distribution at the end of the day. But first, a few questions I would like to ask. The first, why would countries want to opt into our model? One of the first things that their first speaker does to say, like, nobody is going to want to do this. Countries like the US never have an incentive to help out countries like South Sudan, so they won't opt in. We say that's exactly the problem. The reason wealth stays centralized in the 1%, countries like Scandinavia and countries like the United States have a seat, is because they never have an incentive to help nations like South Sudan. Understanding in this house that helping nations like South Sudan is a good thing, that people are suffering then, we all want to alleviate their suffering. The question then becomes, how do you do that? This is where our policy becomes important, because we would force nations like the US and Scandinavia to render unto us the money that they have, money that they never would have spent helping South Sudan, and then take that money and give it to populous nations that need it to feed their populous people. Have a seat. To feed their populations. So the second thing then is the principle, like, where does duty of care, to how far does duty of care extend? Here is a very dodgy principle, because they say if you work hard for your money, you should have ownership of that money. But if you think about it, that's fundamentally against the idea of tax. Because if I work hard to till the soil on my farm, by your logic, I own my money in entirety. So I shouldn't even have to surrender it to my own government, lest why should my government have to surrender it, surrender it to an international body? But the second principle we would say then is this ignores everything Sid did in his speech to establish how nations that are rich didn't get rich because they worked hard for their money. It's more likely that they got rich because of very arbitrary reasons, like the luck of geography or the luck of history. Scandinavia just so happened to be sitting on oil reserves. Does that give Scandinavia an exclusive right to those oil reserves? We beg to differ. The UK's wealth is premised upon centuries of colonization, and the most populous nations that are most destitute are often as a consequence of this colonization. So we don't like this whole idea that you work hard, therefore money should stay in your country, especially since you got that money off the backs of lots of other people too. It's better that we give the money back to them. Final idea, what about understanding and awareness of tax? We don't really know what Mukris was doing with this amorphous idea about how the world is at a turning point where they're finally understanding how tax works. Okay, tax has always been an obfuscated process, but maybe what you're trying to say is that people are finally understanding that they need to help poor people. That people in the US are more ready to surrender their tax because they see welfare as a good thing. The question then becomes, why is proximity, why can proximity not be transcended? If people in the US realize that welfare is important, Obamacare is important, we think they'll also be able to understand that this is important, more important in places like South Sudan and in places like China who cannot feed themselves. So we think then, awareness and understanding of tax isn't likely to change on your side of the house. What does change as a result of our policy, though? First, we would argue to you that there is an exclusive harm to the people in poor nations that have huge populations and cannot afford to deal with them. We say our policy alleviates that immediately. When you're taking money from rich countries and redistributing the wealth, that has a number of benefits. The first is that countries that otherwise never would have gotten these resources now would. It means that they become more likely to be able to loan from places like the World Bank or the IMF, who previously would not have loaned them any developmental aid because of their bad track records and whatnot. They can pump this money into development, more FDI floods into this country. As a result, quality of life in these places increase. That's the ultimate goal that we think we can achieve when we force countries like the US to surrender up money to South Sudan, and as you concede, they otherwise would not in absentia of our policy. Before I continue, sure.
Currently, member states of the IMF or the World Trade Organization give up a financial amount as a prerequisite to their membership, which goes back to people. What is the incentive for United States right now if you're only going to argue that it is your luck and we can now force you to give it to people?
Okay, there is no difference from what you just said, because you just said that you're forced to surrender up money to be part of the institution of the IMF. It's the same thing. You are forced to surrender up money. The question then becomes, how is that money redistributed? The nuance we have on our side is that it's redistributed based on per capita. On your side, that money is scarcely redistributed, and there's no metric in which countries like South Sudan or countries like China can make that money. So we think this is the better metric to take money from rich nations that have to surrender it anyway and give it to poorer nations. The benefits of these being obvious. But the second part and the most important part of this idea is the idea that we need two things. First, the principle that nations don't own the wealth that they have, and it's best that the wealth is spread equally among all nations. We say that the oil in which the Nordic countries sit is owned equally by the rest of the world, as are the Nordic countries. And this is a very important principle that we would like to power our theory. But secondly, we would say that this changes the dynamic of soft politics, because people inside a state have to consider that the money that they have is not just for based on proximity. I don't owe a duty of care just to my fellow Americans. In fact, I owe a duty of care to the rest of the world, especially since populations are always going to negate how much money you make. So if you are Singapore and you have a small population and a booming economy, that means that you're likely to be able to give a really good quality of life to everybody and still have surplus money at the end of the day. But if you are China and you are enjoying the same amount of economic boom, you're unlikely to be able to enjoy those same benefits or render unto your people the same benefits as Singapore would. The reason being is that you just have a much bigger population, and as a result, many more people are likely to fall under the cracks or beyond the sweep of Beijing. That's the central problem with the centralization of wealth in Beijing. This means that with our policy, China gets more money. That's good because it needs that money to spread the wealth out to Xinjiang provinces, to Shenzhen provinces, which is an exclusive benefit you get from our policy. Yes, China is going to get more money. Yes, US is going to have to somehow swallow the fact that some of their tax money is going to, but by the way, US is kind of a populous country too, so they're going to be benefiting. Like Nordic countries and the UK and Singapore have to stomach the fact that some of their money is going to go to populous nations like China. We think that's fine. We're happy to override sovereign claims to money because we think that, I'm sorry, is somewhat smaller than the rights of entire people in Xinjiang provinces and Shenzhen provinces to gain money that they otherwise would not have without our policy. We think in that it allows nations not only to access loans and develop, the end goal always being people in Shenzhen provinces being empowered in ways that they otherwise could not have been. Remember that the population of a nation is a critical criteria. Critical criteria is a very important nuance in how much money the IMF is giving to those nations. And that's a nuance that we're very happy to consider. Proud to propose.
What's the exact phrasing of motion again? Yeah, what's the exact phrasing of motion again? I think. Okay,
This House will distribute all global tax income to countries on per capita.
thank the Speaker for his speech. To extend the case for the opposition bench and try to defeat leader.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will argue from opposition. Population isn't a premise to economic development, Mr. Speaker, but more likely than not, we will argue that economic development comes at the point in which you can operationalize the sort of resources and capital that you may have within a state. And we think what is important for government to understand in this debate is beyond your altruistic principles of wanting to help smaller countries or underdeveloped countries, is that you have to show us why the ability to force a global community to give up the entirety of the tax resources will operationalize to the point of equitable distribution to all these individuals, Mr. Speaker. Before I engage to a larger portion of the soft conflicts and political dynamics that exist in status quo, several points of responses. The first is, let's look at the two premises that I think is untrue on government and why we think their case doesn't make sense. Is that one, they say that the largest countries that exist in the world are often the ones that are the largest countries or the most booming economies are the ones that are often underpopulated, and we don't think that's true across all countries. But number two, that burgeoning economies right now are largest countries are often overpopulated, and cannot operationalize. We think that the way in which government approaches this debate is such a tunnel view concept of how they view economics in the world, Mr. Speaker. It's as if in many different countries or many burgeoning economies, there is no poor people in that country that the state still owes a duty to as to where their resources go, Mr. Speaker. We will argue that the point at which a country utilizes their optimization and strategy in where their money goes to is very important, because the duty still extends to people who are most proximate to them. Secondly, they say, we will argue, Mr. Speaker, it's not just about the process or the outcomes, but it's also about the processes, right? And that's why my prior was very important. So Nisha was flippant to say there's no difference. The distinction between giving aid or giving up a fee as a member of an international organization versus being forced to give up your tax revenue is twofold. One is the ability to consent to the processes in giving up your resources to ensure that there's a balance between the people in your country as well as the membership that you owe a duty to. But secondly, it's also about proportion, right? Because we think that at the point at which you tell a state that the entirety of your resources right now is owed to a collective good, rather than the ability for states to decide what is strategic for my resources to go to. Do I prioritize sometimes defense and welfare in my country and sometimes giving out money to membership, or the entirety of the resources, no thank you, being held at ransom by the international community and smaller states? Thirdly, we will argue that there is a problem in the way in which they operationalize this policy, Mr. Speaker. If you're going to say that our states that are bad in governance, that will never have equitable distribution to the pre-existing welfare that exists in the states, like the Xinjiang province that Nisha wants to talk about, what is the incentive for one, China to even participate in this policy, but two, for the entirety of this money being given to Xinjiang province, if you're going to argue that China doesn't give a shit about people in that area, Mr. Speaker? We think it's important when you have international organizations that don't owe a duty to states, but rather to people and disseminating financial capacity at need. Lastly, on this notion of working hard and ownership, right? I think they don't understand the distinction between working hard and the ability to have ownership, because it's about proximity. The ability for a state to capitalize on the fact that there are individuals within my country who are operationalizing resources past the point of just mere luck of having that area is really important, because it's a working relationship between the state and the people to ensure some services and infrastructure exist. Nishan then said, oh, why can't we then proximity transcends? Because the literal definition of proximity is people who are closest to you. And that's why we will support things like bettering infrastructures in status quo, like the World Trade Organization or IMF, in trying to disseminate the financial capabilities on an equitable process, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that operating on an altruistic process of trying to help these countries is enough, because I'm not going to contest that some countries don't need these financial capabilities. But I think that at the point at which countries get pissed off, because I don't think they were able to show an incentive past the point of just forcing these countries, we think it is far worse for political will of trying to help people will materialize. And that's going to be the second portion of my speech. Before I move on, yes.
Even if some countries worked hard, even they're already rich off the ingenious, should all that money still be centralized in countries that are already rich, or be given to bigger populations that need it more?
Here's where you don't understand economics, right? Because I told you, a state has to be able to strategize their economic capabilities in trying to assess what is important. We think that often states still engage in relationships across other states in providing things like humanitarian aid or development aid, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that any one country just chooses to keep it to themselves. But even then, if one country chooses to do that, it doesn't mean every other country follows suit, Mr. Speaker. What you do is you punish a state at the point at which they work hard to cultivate an environment. Because it's not just about luck. Countries like Singapore, for God's sakes, worked really hard to establish an economic independence from Malaya because they had little resources to work with, but they were able to create a burgeoning economy, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, we think that taxation operates on a contractual basis, but we think that duty ends when it comes to your people and nothing more. And that's why states came together to create organizations that cater beyond international or country borders, Mr. Speaker, and took on that responsibility to give to people, right? And we think that this responsibility is important because it acknowledges that past a point, our collective responsibility does not sacrifice the individual needs of our countries, Mr. Speaker. What you do, no thank you, is that you create an environment of plausible deniability right now for states that are currently in need in trying to restructure their financial and governmental organizations to say that you don't really need to do anything about it because the entirety of the global communities owes a responsibility past your state. That means political will for people to push for better governance, for example, or better forms of welfare distribution in that state does not exist, and they will never push in politicians or elect politicians that are likely to have material outcomes, Mr. Speaker. That means that if you have a corrupt government, for example, what they're going to argue is we don't really owe a duty to you anymore because we don't have the resources and we don't have to change because the global community will now come in and fill in that vacuum for you. That is problematic. Thirdly, how do you best cultivate global political will? We have to understand that the way in which you approach political will is that it has to acknowledge the fact that you need some semblance of people to have consent as well as some semblance of control in engaging that behavior, Mr. Speaker. And that's why we don't operate on a punitive measure in assessing richer countries. Rather, we operate on a framework of asking these individual countries to have political will to slowly interact or creating change within other countries, right? Everything, when you engage in a confrontational method, it is very likely or not that they will not want to participate, Mr. Speaker. And we think that it has to evaluate an aggregate economy rather than isolated areas within states, Mr. Speaker. And we think at the point at which you tell a country that we do not really care about the poor people in your country because they're just simply lesser people or more people in another country, what you're going to do is a collective voice within individual states to say that our duty right now is to reinforce the way in which we integrate ourselves within our country and protect ourselves first. So it becomes a survival mentality, right? So rather than making them to want to cooperate with each other, what's going to happen is that they're going to say it is the survival of the fittest. We have to prioritize our people first because right now we are being forced, Mr. Speaker. In your world, any incentives to want to help people right now doesn't exist because you are punishing countries, you are forcing them without acknowledging the ability for them to have political will and strategization.
Thank you. Thank the speaker for the speech. To solve the case for the government bench, I advise you to
I think we need to introduce the concept of harm minimization in this debate because the contention from opposition is that they said our model is not feasible, people won't opt in, countries wouldn't participate. I would say those things are our worst case scenario and is status quo. So it means our worst case, people will opt in, people would no country to participate, no welfare for these poorer countries, and that is status quo. That is literally your best case under your side of the house. So there was no discussion about after our model is passed and implemented, why are there still harms after the model is implemented? We need to hear that from the third speaker. I will talk about two things. Number one, whether do they have duty to help other countries or not? Secondly, how do you best help poorer countries? Before that, few rebuttals. They say we diminish authority for states to be strategic in their own economic decisions. I agree. I would say that US should prioritize more on defense and should help more countries in the world. And we say you also need to defend that some countries currently don't have any authority to be strategic in their economic policy as well. Countries that are poor, they have no ability to actually do anything in their governance. So we say we help them better. So if you say that we diminish certain authority for states to be autonomous in their own decisions, you also have to defend a world where people don't have money. Countries that have money, they cannot make any economic decisions at all. Secondly, there was a bit soft line coming from side opposition. They say we want to support humanitarian aid, we want to support developmental aid. Those things are literally the same thing as our policy. It means our policy is better when all countries are forced to participate. It means more things that we can get. sit down. Secondly, they say, oh, people wouldn't fight for good government because now they think that, oh, everything is okay. I say the reason why people fight if they are suffering. So even if people are suffering with our policy, they will still fight the government, right? It's not like after we have this policy, suddenly like all the corrupted government will just remain in power. Secondly, this argument is against welfare. So it's like we shouldn't give people welfare because they become complacent and therefore we should just let them suffer. I say no. See, there's no correlation between helping these individuals and making them fight the fight. We say they can fight the fight at the same time if we help them. So they say about survival mentality will exist. I say that is status quo. The status quo is survival mentality is so much worse in your world when there's no ability for the international community to regulate that. At least the survival mentality in our world is being regulated and checked. Individuals are forced to join our model and will be forced to help the poorer countries, and that's the benefit that we get. Sit down. Lastly, about corrupted countries. I agree corrupted countries might be corrupted under both worlds, but we say they will be less corrupted when they have more money. The example of this, for example, like North Korea, when we cut off aid from them, what they did was they took all the money from their own people, they took all the food from their own people. These things literally will make things worse. When we give them more money, these countries actually will become better. That's something that we want to defend. Secondly, we say corrupted countries will happen under both sides as well. So those things will happen in your world as well. So firstly, do they have duty to help other countries? So firstly, they said that states should have ability to be strategic, and they should and proximity literally means like people who are close to you. That's what we contest. We want to reconceptualize the duty of state. We say the duty of state should transcend beyond borders. That's why they never understood. The only thing they said is that, oh, we should prioritize proximity without the reasoning why. We say that the duty towards humanity belongs to everyone. It means it transcends beyond borders. That's why we intervene in certain countries, even if it's harmful. We actually try to protect as much people as possible, even if it means we actually do violate sovereignty of countries. Let's talk about South Sudan. We see South Sudan currently, your world, they won't get anything. Maybe per capita, maybe it's not the best metric, but we say at least in our world, they get some money compared to none at all. So you would have to define a world where countries literally don't give money at all, and that's why how will be a better place for everyone. So South Sudan might suffer in both worlds, but less suffering in our world when they get some money from international community. Thirdly, they say that capability does not equate to obligation. We beg to differ. We see capability, it does equate to obligation. When you have the capability to actually help individuals, when the magnitude of harm is so big, then you should you should try your best to help individuals. That's why we subpoena witness, for example, to make sure that they help others. Actually, we tax rich people to help the poor people. If you are against the capability means obligation, you are also principally against taxation as a whole. This is not something that you should defend in this debate. Before I move on, yeah, sure.
If the main thrust of your case is harm minimization, and you're going to say that corrupted states exist in the world, isn't it minimizing harm when you remove like absolute financial capabilities and giving it to the states carte blanche? Yeah, so let's see what happened, right? When we actually try to sanction these countries, they become worse. They took money from their own people. So like for example, in North Korea now, they have like loyalty policy where they have to surrender the food towards the government. It becomes worse. You'd rather a world where, for example, currently we harm minimize when US and China actually giving money to North Korea, and they don't actually keep their people just to get money. So how do we best help developing countries? I think there was no discussion in their world, for example, because the only rebuttal they had as our policy is not feasible. It ignores all the benefits like we told you. For example, now countries that are poor are forced to concede in certain trade agreements that are disproportionately harms them. For example, you have to export things at such a low price because they are desperate. It means other bigger countries can actually prey on this country's desperation and actually make them concede in certain trade agreements that are not strategic for them. So if you want to support like strategic decisions, we would say in our world when they have money, they have more political bargaining chip in the trade agreements. It will be better for them because they can make things better on our side of the house. Secondly, we say money is the initiator of other things as well. For example, you can get loans for IMF or World Bank. These things wouldn't exist in your world when they have no money, no resources, because that is status quo that you are defending. Lastly, we say sometimes things like, for example, you need to initiate certain industries, and the only for you to do that when you have money in the first place. For example, some countries, they have a lot of resources, but they don't have money to extract it, and they have money to sell it to other nations. In our world, these countries will be helped. We will actually tax all the global economy and make sure that they give these poorer countries, and they can initiate certain industries that are beneficial for them. So, for example, like in Latvia, about how the agriculture started because they had money in the first place. So, how the revolution of
industry happened because they had money in the first place. So those things will only exist in a world where they have agency and control over their own countries. We agree. We do diminish the ability for certain countries to be autonomous in certain way, but we give more autonomy to more countries because more countries can get the money and can enjoy the same benefit. We would prefer a world if the ability for individuals to help another person transcends beyond borders. It's not limited to proximity. They will be happy to reconceptualize the duty of state if it means we can help more people. You cannot simply defend a status quo without telling me why is it comparative better in our model. At least our model will give certain countries certain things that they wouldn't have gotten in your model. So I beg to propose.
Okay.
Yeah, bro.
There are three central areas in this debate, and I'll be assessing each one of them. Firstly, I'll talk to you about the principle of equitable distribution as discussed by both sides. Second of all, I'll talk to you about this duty of care. And thirdly, I'll talk to you about the results of the proposal that came from the government bench and why it is simply a bad world to live in. Firstly, let's look at equitable distribution. So the primary thrust that came from the proposition is that it is equitable distribution because more often than not, you have no control over the economic development that you have because it's always controlled by factors that you can't control, such as geographical location, so on and so forth. The problem here, however, is that it's completely premised that economic development is based on those things. We would say that there are a lot of instances that shows that it is not as absolute as they say. A lot of economic development, as we've observed in, for example, Singapore and Sierra Leone, are never at all based on the resources and the geographical location that they have. For example, in the case of Singapore, no thank you, sir, it's primarily based on, if one may argue, leadership, policies, and also the productivity of its citizens, so on and so forth. Or in Sierra Leone, they have abundant resources, primarily like diamonds, but they don't necessarily show the result of actually having those resources. This means it's more often than not a personalized development that's based on policies, that's based on the political will of individuals. Therefore, what this establishes to you, Mr. Speaker, is that there is no logical and coherent justification to establish that it is based on these things. What this then shows to you is that in comparison to the opposition bench, what we've told you is that the relationship that individual states and also their taxes is a personalized relationship as well. Because we would say that tax gains by individual states are premised primarily on the political positioning of their states, the policy of these states, their leadership, and more importantly, the human capital production of that state. This means that more often than not, the amount of tax that you would have received in one state is based on the personalized hard work that each and every one of citizens did contribute to their state. The amount of work that they put in when they work as a government servant, the amount of work that they put in when they work in a private practice and then paying income tax to the state, for example. This means it's all completely based on a factor that is controlled by the people and for the people, but not necessarily by any of the factors that is out of control that came from that state. This means, ladies and gentlemen, we are breaking this principle of equitable distribution because equitable distribution denotes that they have no control over the amount of resources and economic development that they are in. Therefore, it is fair for us to give the amount based on how unlucky or how little of the people that you have there. Because of this logical link broken, we don't think this principle stands. No, thank you. Let's look at this argument on duty, because they seem to argue that, well, we have already conceded that we've already provided aid, that more often than not, states are already providing duty to help more impoverished states. Therefore, what's the difference? Here's the thing. There's a difference between the duty that they are imposing on the state and also the duty that we have taken. The reason being is because of consent to the amount of developmental aid that we provide to the people. No, thank you. And the reason for this, ladies and gentlemen, is because
It's based on the consent as well as the political will of the people as to how much of that tax goes to aid and also developing countries, as opposed to collective good that are primarily based for them, because that is the legitimate expectation that they have taken upon themselves when they start working, when they start paying tax. This is literally the incentive, no thank you, the incentive that individuals do have principally why they even pay tax to begin with. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that if they have none of this legitimate expectation and they do not have this legitimate expectation to rely on, it is unlikely that we are able to prove productivity. It is unlikely that we are able to prove will of them even paying that said tax to begin with. Because let's look at the duty that we have imposed, that we have taken upon ourselves when it comes to giving developmental aid. In a democratic process, Mr. Speaker, there is express consent that the amount of money that is being given by the state to a developing country, or the defense aid that we provide in the Middle Eastern countries by the United States, for example, is based on the political will of that democratic party that is being conferred and mandated on by the individuals. This means that it's not a simple binary. This means that if I were to vote for a political party and I have the political will to want to help countries in the Middle East, for example, I will want my state to provide aid to them. But at the same time, I also mandated my country and also my state to provide aid and tax to my own collective well-being and the services that we have expected from the state as a result of us paying tax to them, ladies and gentlemen. This means it's important to note is that each individual, when they practice this legitimate expectation, has an expectation over the operations of their money, and we think it is unjustified and also very counterproductive to defy this productivity that individuals have expected, has or provided in return of the expectation of tax. So,
if your metric of duty is consent, are you then willing to defend a world where people don't help others because simply they don't consent?
Well, if they are really a state that does not consent to helping people, then chances are the international community would have done something and demonized them. So what? But the point is, more often than not, states do consent to helping people. But the thing is, how they consented and what they do when they consent is different. Yours is unjustified. Ours is more equitable and also more fairer to not just the developing states, but also to the people even paying these taxes to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. And that's important to note. Third issue, we provide you a dire outcome that have not been responded to by that side of the house. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that more often than not, individual states have taken upon themselves to ensure reforms and ensure help that is provided to the people. Let's understand firstly that most states, more often than not, do impose income tax onto their people. Their problem here is that it's not reaching towards the people, or it's not enough, and therefore we should probably mandate other states to be paying this tax for them as well. But not necessarily proving us that if there is already income tax that is being imposed onto other people in third world countries, for example, and it's not going down to the people, how is the money that they're going to be getting from our side of the house, from bigger countries, will actually trickle down to the people as well? If China, for example, has a lot of money but does not give money to the Xinjiang province, how do you assure that it goes to the Xinjiang province? So the fact here remains is that reform is important, and reform will not happen under that side of the house because people can rely on plausible deniability that other states will be giving money to me, especially when corruptive states will be less likely to listen to the will of the people, because now they know that people should be dwindling down their protests, because now they know and they can see that money is being reached for them and towards the state. The state has no incentive to be less bastardous than they are.
Thank the Speaker for his speech. That ends the substantive portion of the debate in the reply and opposition.
At this point, we think that government is stuck on the surface level of the characterization. All of their gripe is contingent upon like simplistic principles like consent, responsibility, harm minimization, without acknowledging the fact that that the compass in the world of opposition isn't a world without all of those things, but the comparative between to what extent do we extend the responsibility of those states? To what extent can states consent? To what extent can states engage in harm minimization between a balance of their own people as well as the global community, Mr. Speaker? Because we told you in opposition that amassing a global tax revenue and amassing it per capita is going to not reach an equitable outcome in terms of distribution and going to be counterproductive. On government, they took upon a burden to say that right now you will remove poverty, you will build up structures in the states, you will have political mobilization, and countries are like Singapore are able, that countries have like Singapore don't have a duty to its people but to the rest of the world. We think that this is a myopic and tunnel vision approach to the debate, Mr. Speaker, because if you're going to argue that Singapore is a great country, obviously there's going to be people like Mitra who can fly here like in an expensive ticket, but there are also still people who have to take buses to cross into Malaysia, Mr. Speaker, and that's an important acknowledgement in this debate. Let's also acknowledge the fact that there was very little discussion to the elements of per capita on side of government, because beyond the point of saying that burgeoning economies are underpopulated and that larger countries are a lot poorer, we think there was very little analysis as to why a population is a determinant as to how much money do we give to a country, Mr. Speaker. There needs to be a convergence. Just because you're a richer country, it does not mean that every person in that country is living an optimum life. Just because you're a poor country, it does not mean no one is helping you in status quo, Mr. Speaker. The debate has to operate on a balance right now, rather than just assuming that harm minimization apparently solves everything in every single debate. So let's assess the second part, which is the principle justification. We told you it is very hard for us to speculate the outcomes to materialize and past the point of saying it will be not constructive, because it's all about incentives, right? And incentives relies on the 3 C's, which is consent, control, and COP, Mr. Speaker. And we think that this is all relative to the amount of proportion that you can give and participate as a country. And that's why we say taxation in and of itself is an important principle that states rely on, because it's really about strategizing the amount and having ability to control where my money goes to, and at the same time, how much do I want to participate in a global framework, Mr. Speaker. They say, oh well, they will do it anyway. We will argue that there's no political will right now, because you are essentially essentializing these countries to be colonialists and saying that you are being punished right now, rather than acknowledging that some countries did not get it that way, Mr. Speaker. There was no analysis to state expectations. There was no analysis to political will. There was no analysis to how do you engage in a creating political will for people to be happy about the fact that their resources are going to another country. Then government had a gripe, right? We're being unfair. So let's assume but not concede that countries will not participate. Does it necessarily lead to the people that you wanted to talk about in like Xinjiang province or Xinjiang province apparently, right? Because I don't know what other examples you want to talk about. We think that all of your burden in this debate is contingent upon the ability for that money to trickle down and materialize to these individuals anyway. What was the characterization government then provided in this debate? The reason why money in status quo or income tax in those countries don't materialize to people is because the state is problematic, because the state is corrupted, because the state doesn't know what the hell they want to do or how much they want to use that money. The line of logic then becomes is that a corrupted state becomes less corrupted because they will not have more money. I don't understand how that operates. I think you might want to explain that to Najib. Maybe, you know, that could be a better principle in this debate, right? We think that lastly, you have to acknowledge political dynamics in this debate. When it comes to the state being able to claim plausible deniability in its responsibility to its individuals, not just states who have burgeoning economies, but states that are problematic and sluggish in nature, but also international organizations who took on the mantle of trying to crack economic development all across the world and now punishing countries who are their members, who did give some financial capabilities for these organizations to operationalize to begin with. We think past the point of altruism, government has no bite in this debate.
Thank the speaker for the speech. To was the case for the government bench, the debate as a whole, and right become.
Let's have a discussion on which model allows for better distribution. On Gov, let's just take out this whole idea of consent and political will. Because over here, you have an idea that nations should always have an autonomy over how much aid they choose to render unto other states. But you must then be willing to defend a world in which states decide not to give, to not consent, into opting into altruism at all. In fact, your entire principle of proximity that you argued quite consistently down the bench seems to indicate just that. You've asserted to us down the bench bench that a nation owes responsibility to its own people and are not likely to give huge amounts of money to aid. And therefore, they're more likely to spend that money in their defense budget, in their Obamacare budget. And that means that you have to defend a world where proximity prevents you from getting any of the aid you claim nations will give of their own consent. We think then big populations don't get any of that aid, and this was the problem that we addressed right from the get-go. We say big rich nations often never consent to give that money to global development aid, and that money stays locked up in the 1%, and as a result, the 1% enjoys the greatest soft political power in the world and are able to make decisions based off the swords of everybody else. We think that's horrible. But even in your best case, that these rich nations decide to give lots of money, this misses all the analysis in my speech that told you that that money is going to be misallocated anyway because it doesn't take into consideration the very valuable nuance of populations. I explained to you that an economic boom in China is a very different thing compared to an economic boom in Singapore. And the difference is in their size of population. If they both enjoy a 7% growth, obviously Singapore is more likely to be able to optimize that growth to make the lives of its people better. But if China enjoys that same growth, the spillover doesn't reach far away Xinjiang, and it doesn't reach far away Shenzhen. This is not because China doesn't want to help those people. Of course it does. The Politburo in China would love to have the additional support of people living in far Tibet and far Beijing. China is not evil. Rather, the nuance we gave you was that China simply cannot. We think that maybe China is booming, therefore everybody must be okay. But the truth of the matter is that booming populations often counter the weight that booming economies give you. We need to enable China to spill money over to Xinjiang, and we only can do that when we take a hard stance. The reason why this is so soft over here is because if you're always going to depend on nations to give you aid and they don't, then you lose out on the aid. The comparative is that we need to force people, force rich countries to divert, force money to be diverted from rich countries to poor countries. We think we get a better spillover on our side, and we are more than happy to trade off all of this like consent and political will. Now, let's do a comparison of the harms to benefits ratio. Literally the only harm and the only discussion they wanted to have on our policy is that, wait a minute, it's punitive. Let's not punish big governments because they will be angry. This is incredibly soft, and let me tell you why it's harmful. It's soft because it doesn't deal with Sid's analysis that a lot of these nations should be punished, that they have no claim to the money that you claim they worked hard for. We say it's all arbitrary, and oftentimes it's based off of a lot of exploitation of other nations, using their existing wealth to trick nations into bad economic deals and bad trade agreements that they have to opt into because they're desperate. Oftentimes colonization, awful things, and these countries should be punished for. But even if they didn't engage in colonization, like Australia or Japan, Sid already told you that these countries should be punished for omission because they do not give as much as they could give to help nations that need that money more than they do. Big populations in Uganda and in India and in Pakistan continue to live in horrible, destitute conditions because these countries choose to omit any action. We think then we're so happy to punish them. We're happy to go hardline, and we're happy to force them to render onto us money that we otherwise never would have gotten in the first place. Is per capita the best distribution policy? Probably not, but it's a hell of a lot better than anything you have in status quo. In this discussion, you have no discussion as to how countries like Uganda or India are going to get any better, and they're likely to continue living in these awful conditions. We think then this has to change. If we want to get money into the hands of nations that are poorer with bigger populations, obviously a model has to account for the size of populations. We are more than happy to force wealth out of rich nations who never deserved it in the first place and put that wealth in the hands of those who rightfully did.
Next thing for debate is on floor shake hands to the outside. Okay, so you all have a decision. Okay, so come up with a decision, then explain to me the reasons for it. No, no. So each of you individually come out with a decision, then explain to me the reasons for it.
and the mechanism can benefit in the long term.
Okay.
And for each side opposition, they does not put years in their own point, and they did not really answer what they asked them. Yeah. So that's what.
Anything else?
I thought like substantive wise, they provided more substantive the opposition. And this one, for the government side, they provided the harm benefit ratio, where they acknowledge the harms, and then they provide the solution to cater to the current existing problems. They also provide relevant extensions and examples for the opposition side. The opposition side, I felt like they had more substantive, and they would be very realistic about the status quo, and they mainly state the current problems that we have and the process to what extent we need instead of countering uncertain questions or actually countering the harms that they did not actually acknowledge harms, but they didn't acknowledge as to the depth and extent compared to the both be very compared analysis. But I would say the relevance to this motion again because they stated about per capita. They did, but it wasn't as as strong as I would like it.
That's the new bit part again.
Sure. Thanks. Just for me, check you. You hear my justification. Oh. No, I need to. Yeah.
Comment?
No.
All right.
That's why sleep is the obviously people in this like similar when our converse of shit. Grace.
Okay, sorry it took some time. It was obviously a high level debate, I really enjoyed and to talk to trainees. So the 2-2 split. The win went to opposition.